paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers! I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Bryant, and welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. Today, my guest is Randy Noblet. He's a professor of clinical psychology at the Los Angeles campus of Alliant International University. And he has worked with many trauma survivors over the years. How you doing today, Randy?
I'm doing good. It's nice to meet you, Nick.
It's nice to meet you. We've never met each other. I've known about your work for quite some time, and I think you've known about my work for quite some time.
Yes.
So your expertise involves working with trauma, DID, and victims of ritual abuse. Would you agree with that?
Well, that is my main area of work. I think people sometimes debate whether or not I have expertise in it or not. Some think I'm heading in the wrong direction. Others think I'm right on the money.
And you and your wife wrote a book called Cult and Ritual Abuse, Narratives, Evidence, and Healing Approaches. Can you give us an overview of that?
Well, it's the third edition of a book that was first published in 1995. And the third edition, was also supported by a sabbatical from my university. So my university allowed me to take a paid semester off to write the book, which surprised me because it's obviously a very controversial topic, but I at least had that support from my university, so I appreciated that. So the book is my effort to understand a kind of narrative that many psychologists and other therapists encounter. And when I first encountered it, I was an Air Force psychologist in England, and so this particular book begins with a chapter called The Church in Thetford Forest. So I had a young man come see me. He was an enlisted man, and I changed his name in the book so it wouldn't identify him. So I called him Sergeant Hoffer. And but he came to me saying that he was afraid that he might be gay. And this was back in 1979, when homophobia was much more rampant, and in the military it was considered cause to be discharged. So I asked him why he had that particular worry, and he said he'd been to a sex party in a church not far from the base, and that at this particular party, he said people were wearing robes and there were candles and chanting to Satan. And during this event, he apparently alleged that a male person who was officiating forced him to engage in sex with him. And so he did not resist, he said, and so he feared that he might be gay. And at that particular time, I think a lot of mental health professionals didn't really think that whether one was gay or not was a mental health issue. It was more, as now we see it just as a characteristic that people are not all the same about, as far as their sexual identity, as far as their sexual orientation. Anyway, so I met with him several times, and eventually he said that he felt like he wasn't gay, and actually it didn't really matter to me. And he left therapy saying that he felt better. So that was a remarkable story for me to hear as a young psychologist overseas. And I wondered if there was any truth to it. If it wasn't true, then why would anyone come in and tell this and risk possibly being dishonorably discharged from the Air Force? Why would anyone do that? I did respect his privacy, and so I did not report his allegations to anyone that had authority or any kind of punitive power. So he told me where the church was while we met. And so later I drove out to that location, and there was indeed a church off in the distance in the forest, an abandoned church. So the structure existed. I did not try to wander through the brush and foliage to get to it, but at least that part of the story was validated. So I guess my initial interest in this was to find what is the truth. This is an incredible story, and but at the time I presumed that this was just a really bizarre story that an individual client brought in, and I probably would never hear another story like that again. And the reason the date is significant, 1979, is because at that time, narratives and stories about ritual abuse were basically unknown in the media. They were unknown in academia. And in the book, I discussed a little bit about the Hellfire Clubs of England and Ireland. So I remembered when this young man was telling the story, I remembered that in a history class at college, they had talked about the Hellfire Clubs. And these were also sort of a semi-Masonic or Masonic-like gathering of prestigious and politically powerful people. So I thought I might read more about that. So I started to research allegations that have been made on this. Now, in the meantime, I also, my main area of work clinically was with people who did self-injury. So people with suicide risks, people who, for example, damaged their body, did self-harm deliberately. And at the time I began this work, the common diagnosis that was being used was borderline personality disorder. And it was, in fact, in 1980, that diagnosis was just introduced into the Diagnostic Manual of Psychiatrists. So this was kind of a new thing. And many psychologists did not want to work with these individuals because of the risk of, well, they had very painful stories and they did harm to themselves. It was not fun work. But I was finding that I was having some success with them. I was able to work with these individuals who otherwise were very challenging and make progress. So I continued to do that work. And when I set up my own practice in Dallas, Texas, after leaving the Air Force, lots of people made referrals because this was not a kind of client that many people wanted to work with. As I started to get these clients, I found that some of them started doing something that to me was actually bizarre. They were dissociating. When I was in graduate school, I graduated in 1978, and in graduate school, dissociation and dissociative identity disorder, that was then called MPD, or multiple personality disorder, was considered iatrogenic. So there was not much literature on it. Most of the literature that did exist was, again, this sort of false memory syndrome kind of theory. Nicholas Spanos was one of the main writers on this topic at that time. So I remember I was referred I'll say patient, because she was in the hospital, by a neurologist. She was having intractable headaches. So I met with her in the hospital. I gave her psychological testing. We're trying to figure out, are there any psychological factors that are operative? And if medications would be helpful, are there any particular medications that might be recommended? And while I was visiting with her, I addressed her by her name. So in the book, I also discuss this particular case, and I think I renamed her Susie. And so I addressed her as Susie, and she said, "I'm not Susie." And so I'd never heard anyone say that to me. I'm not who I am, So I said, "Well, how may I address you?" And she said, "I'm little Susie." And her voice changed, and even though this was a grown adult, her behavior was very childlike. And anyway, so this was a shock to me. I was basically a false memory syndrome type psychologist at the time, although there was no false memory syndrome foundation at the time.
That's very good.
But I was learning that I had been trained incorrectly, that this really was a clinical phenomenon. And so among the clients that I had worked with, people who did a lot of self-harm and had suicide risk, and by the way, they also commonly had substance use problems, so alcohol and other drugs. In any case, this became a major area of work for me. One of the and very challenging, because in part because the clients are just very challenging themselves, but also as we approached the 1990s, this is when the False Memory Syndrome Foundation did actually form itself, and it created a political lobby that, from my perspective, was intended to punish anyone who assisted or advocated for people who did dissociate, or people who talked about ritual abuse. So this very first client that I saw, not the serviceman, but the patient in the hospital, shortly after I talked to little Susie, I talked to another. She switched, and I talked to someone called the Evil One. And I presumed that this was just a part of her that thought they were evil. But actually later, over time, so this was all a surprise to me, was supposedly demonic. Or it was an alter personality, but the alter understood himself to be a demon. So I did not come into this with these beliefs. I came into this whole clinical area with totally opposite beliefs. So it was very surprising and even shocking to me that people were telling these stories.
When I approached the Franklin scandal, I was very, very skeptical, of the story. And I've talked about it on my show before. I knew that something had happened, but I never thought that I was going to run into the evil labyrinthian Leviathan that I ran into. Let's back up a little bit. Could you elucidate the Hellfire Club?
Well, the professor, my history professor in undergrad, only mentioned it in passing. And the professor talked about there was this Hellfire Club in England, and it was just really a bunch of adult men who wanted to party and get away with doing things that were considered unacceptable at the time, and so they formed this Hellfire Club. But and so the professor mentioned, but it was not truly satanic, which seemed odd to me, because how would anyone know? And one way or the other, it was odd that a professor, a scholar, would opine about something that is so controversial, and there's so little evidence even now, one way or the other, for. So since then, I've done more reading about it. Carl Raschke actually wrote a book called Painted Black, and he spent some time talking about the Hellfire Club. Apparently, this particular club existed in a variety of locations in England. Probably the most famous was in High Wycombe, which was just somewhat west of London. It's a location that still has the caves. So there were caves dug for the purpose of this gathering. This was not the only location, though. There was also a Hellfire Club in the outskirts of Dublin, and that structure still exists. And there were several authors who wrote about the Hellfire Club as if it was something that really existed. And so I guess it's not surprising that in 18th century England that people were getting together and having what at the time was viewed as illicit sex. That's not shocking or surprising. But what was more bizarre to me was they would have specific mockery of religion. So they would have women who would come, and the women would be dressed as nuns or called nuns, and they would have the presence of someone who played the role of the devil in particular, and some of them actually they took on alternate names, and so this was part of the practice. So why did they want to include those themes in their revelry? That it just seemed odd to me.
Well, it's interesting. Like you had said before, this was the cream of the crop of British society. And there were orgies going on in these caves, that we know of. I haven't read about any children being involved, but I've certainly read about orgies. And one of America's founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, was an attendee at the Hellfire Club.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if there were any other American founding fathers that were attendees at the Hellfire Club. John Adams doesn't strike me as the type, but you never know with some of them.
Yeah. So, and this is where we sort of can start to also think about more about the kind of Masonic fraternal organizations and other similar fraternal organizations. So much of the Hellfire Club operated and was run by Masonic individuals who also were aristocrats. But in the U.S., there's also a very odd history of Masonry, and there's a Masonic museum in Illinois. I think the museum still exists, and there was a catalog that is still available. I believe it's posted on the internet, where one can purchase Masonic paraphernalia. I don't know that it's still something that one can use. One can make an order from nowadays, but at one particular time, it was like a Sears catalog for ordering Masonic regalia and equipment. And one of the items that they sold was so for Masonic initiations, and the initiations are done, as we understand, with adult males typically. But they involve frightening or rigorous kinds of ordeals, and not necessarily worse than what a fraternity prank might involve, but along that line. One of the items sold by this catalog was a table, and the table was constructed so that it could spin. And on the page in the catalog, you see a man tied to a table, and there's another man who has a device that he's holding in his hand, that is actually an electric shocker. And so the catalog explains that, and that man has a devil costume on. And you can buy the devil costume along with the shocker, along with the table that spins.
If you bought all three, would they give you a better price?
I don't know. I don't think it's still available from that particular company, but the catalog is still here.
So you yourself have, now there are millions of Masons in the world, and my next question isn't categorical of all Masons. In a previous show, I have talked about the jesters, which are part of the Masons that seem to be extremely lecherous. And actually, there's evidence that they've committed statutory rape in South America along the Amazon. So when I say Masons, I'm not saying all the Masons in the world, because I know some Masons, and
yeah,
I would find, they're upstanding, nice people.
Yes.
But there seems to be a pocket within Masonry, the jesters being one, that's a little malevolent. And you, I believe, have also encountered some malevolence with Freemasonry.
Well, that's what my clients have talked about. On one occasion, I was doing group therapy, and the whole issue of Masons came up, and I'd never heard of Masons as perpetrators prior to that. And so I asked the group, how many of you came from Masonic families? And so everybody but one raised their hand. So apparently it was very common. My assumption is that most Masons are probably decent human beings. But one thing about Masonry is it was a way that prohibited occult knowledge could be transmitted during eras of European history, when people would have been burned at the stake or otherwise severely punished for either practicing or articulating those views. So it was an opportunity for people to secretly talk about occult things. I'm guessing that many Masons have no interest in occultism. But my interpretation of Masonry is that it does, it is a way of passing on some kinds of secret knowledge that were otherwise unacceptable in earlier European and European American traditions. So examples being Gnosticism is a very important theme, I think, in Masonry.
And could you explain Gnosticism to my audience?
Sure. So Gnosticism is a religious or spiritual perspective, and it's very old. It probably has been in existence at least since the 2nd century. And by the way, Karl Raschke, who I mentioned earlier, is also an expert. So he's a professor of religious studies. He's an expert on Gnosticism. But it was a religious view. And just like Christianity, there were a variety of different Gnostic organizations and congregations. But as a general rule, the Gnostics thought that the creator was evil. So their theory was that actually we are all spirits, and our spirits are good, but this evil creator put our spirits into human bodies, and now that we're in human bodies, we have to suffer. So this is not exactly Satanism. It's more Satanism on its side. So the idea that the creator is malevolent. But they also did, so some of the Gnostics did allegedly also have a view that evil is also sacred. So I think many monotheists nowadays have the perspective that that which is sacred is good, and that which is evil is bad. Whereas in Gnosticism, good and evil are both sacred. So some of the early Christian writers wrote about the Gnostics, who were very soon they were labeled as heretics, and this is really where the Spanish Inquisition began, was killing Gnostics. And it didn't begin in Spain, it began in France and Italy. But at one time, the Gnostics, of whom the Albigensians were one of the well-known sects, were virtually wiped out at the time. So again, like the Templars, who were not necessarily Gnostic, but the Templars also were wholesale killed by Philip IV of France. But as you pointed out in one of your previous podcasts, many of them went other places, including Scotland, and we had the Scottish Rite Freemasons. So Masonic lore continues perhaps the traditions of these heretic Gnostics as they were conceptualized, and also Knights Templar.
I just want to clarify, the Inquisition did not begin in Spain, but Spain elevated it to an art form.
Yeah.
So,
but what was going on in the south of France was in many ways worse. So one of the historically famous quotations about the invasions of Provence, one of the officers told the commander of the Catholic forces that the village we are approaching has some Catholics in it. What should we do? And the response, according to this, and I think historians debate whether this is literally, this quotation is literally true, but the tradition was, he said, "Kill them all, God will know his own." But there were whole cities that were plundered and devastated, and so this was the history of southern France, Italy, and it moved into Spain, and then we had the witchcraft trials that really traveled everywhere, including the New World.
So with the Masons, you have dealt with clients who have claimed to be abused by Masons?
Yes. One of my the clients I worked with, she actually brought me her father's Masonic apron. And in addition to that, she brought me a black robe.
And have you had a number of these clients over the years, or?
Yes, they're very common. There was a book written, one of the early books on ritual abuse. The title was Ritual Abuse. I'm trying to remember the author's name. I believe her last name was Smith, and she did a survey of 52 people who said they were survivors of ritual abuse, and that was a commonly reported element of the abuse. And also, as you mentioned, the Extreme Abuse Survey points that out.
And do you find that these victims are dissociated? Are they suffering from DID?
Either DID, as the diagnostic manual describes it, or what's called otherwise specified dissociative disorder. So if you don't meet all the criteria of DID, you can use the OSDD diagnosis. So they meet one or the other.
And I imagine that you would work with integrating these various altars, or else forming some type of system where they can communicate with each other.
Well, I don't ask clients to integrate. Some therapists do. That's a common component to the therapy that's ordinarily done. I don't press people with DID to integrate, because they will often do a pseudo integration. So they will pull it together. They will appear to be okay, but things are really not okay. There are also some people nowadays who view themselves as plural. So in the LGBTQ plus population, there are people who use multiple pronouns. So they may be us or we or they and so on. So it's important to be respectful of people who identify as multiple, whether or not they also report trauma history. So what's important to me is to improve the communication, first of all. So and to identify what are the parts, and to actually speak directly to the parts, so to communicate directly. And usually safety is a big issue. Many of them have a preoccupation with suicide. And so helping the person get more stable regarding self-harm is the first priority. And then improving communication so that they're aware of, for example, they may have like a Charlie Manson personality inside, but they're unaware of it. And to have the improved communication, cooperation. One of the things I do tell clients is I tell them that I don't require integration, but most of my clients do integrate on their own. So they, and to me, that's a better integration when they do it themselves, rather than when I do sort of a therapy ritual where they imagine seeing themselves become one person. But having them still be multiple is actually, it really helps manage the suicide risk. So if someone, many people who come to therapy, if they don't want to go in the hospital or don't want to be honest or candid, they will not disclose their self-harm intentions. And when the therapist can work with the alter personalities, you can often find out information that the client may not even be able to tell you himself or herself. So, for example, I had a client who said I asked her about her self-harm risk, and she said, I'm fine. And it was not very convincing. So I spoke to one of the child alters, and the child alter said, she's got a gun, it's in her nightstand. So then we returned back to the persona, the person who came in, and I said, we're going to need to do one of two things. Either you need to go into a hospital, or you need to give me permission to call your partner at home and have them check the nightstand. And she said, well, have them do that. So the person who came in my office had no idea there was a gun in the nightstand. And so the partner checked it, and there it was. So you often can get information that will help you preclude or prevent an act of self-harm by interacting with the alter personalities.
There are some people with DID that actually, these younger alters, you were talking about a client that had a younger alter. Some of these younger alters have taken all the abuse. So a lot of people would rather not, this is from what I understand, with DID, rather not integrate some of these alters because of the way that the alters have taken the abuse for them. Have you come across that?
No, usually they don't want to integrate alters that where they fear malevolence from the alter. So and they often don't want to get rid of child alters because they may conceptualize that or perceive that as killing them, eliminating them, which is another reason that I don't try to sell that idea to them. But if the therapist can connect effectively with the child alters, there often is at least one child alter that's typically pretty strong and in a pretty good mood, and you often don't want that alter to leave. You want that alter to continue to stay through the whole process of therapy because it's a source of support to the person. When you may have also malevolent alters. So I had a client who had this was a male client, and the alter in question was also a male, was a little boy alter, or he conceptualized himself as a little boy, and his name was Satan. I'm sorry, this was actually a woman client. This is a woman client. She had a little boy alter named Satan. The woman was a devout evangelical Christian. So this was disturbing to her, to have this voice in her head using the name Satan as his own. So basically what I did was I worked with that particular, but I viewed it, again, this as an alter personality and not a demon. And I worked with that particular alter until he became aware that he was in fact the little boy that had been abused. And he cried. So it was a little boy crying. It was a woman, but crying like a little boy. And I said to the little boy who called himself Satan, I said, would you be willing to say a prayer to Jesus, because this woman that you live in her mind, she's Christian, and this would give her a lot of peace. And so he did. And very quickly, she came out of the trance. She came out of the dissociated state and said, that's not Satan. I said, why do you say that? Because he prayed to Jesus. Satan could not pray. So she developed the insight that this was indeed just a child alter. It was a representation of herself, but in this case, as a boy. Many people with DID, especially those who've been ritually abused, have both male and female parts. And but this was a great relief for her to come to this insight. And again, I think a lot of times there's a confusion about is there real demonic possession involved or not?
You use symbols, I believe.
Yes.
To elicit. Are those symbols are they occult symbols or mind control symbols? What could you talk about that? Because I think that's kind of unique as far as
yeah. So one of my main interests. So I've always been wanting to know what is the truth. So I'm hearing these very far out stories. What is the truth? And I'm always open to the possibility that the whole thing is untrue, or some part of it is untrue. I don't discuss that in detail with the client because I don't want to emphasize my malleable attitude. They need to feel my support, and so I focus on interacting with support. But on one occasion, a woman called me up and said, "Would you be my therapist?" And I said, "No, I'm. Why do you even want me as your therapist?" So she said she was a ritual abuse survivor, and she said she was a programmer. And so she said she was a master programmer. So so she said, I really didn't have the time and energy to work with her, but I said, but why me? She said, you're interested in programming. So she called this programming. And I had heard some other people use that term, and I was interested in learning more about it. But again, I didn't know how much of it was totally bogus and how much of it had any real meaning. But why me? She said, you're the only psychologist who's working in this area. Okay, well, that's probably true. And she said, no one in my position has ever gotten out. So I agreed to see her. And so she, in order to work with her, she told me about the way she had been trained and the way she said that other programmers train victims. And so I didn't know if there was any truth to it, but there are certain like words, phrases, patterns of touch. So and that those kinds of stimuli could be paired with trauma. So anyway, she was describing a process of training whereby a person learned to become dissociative, and where the specific altered personalities could be trained to be what they were. And that's what so in discussing this, she talked about how I could access her parts, and I thought that it would be useful to see if it was safe to even do this with other people. And so on one occasion, I had a patient in the hospital, actually several patients in the hospital, and they started talking about certain words that were used in training, in rituals. So I don't want to be too graphic, and also I don't want to use highly triggering material that might be broadcast and might not be in the best interest of everyone. But anyway, so this became something that I became interested in. I wanted to check it out and see, is this really something, is this just a weird belief that some people have, or if this stimulus is used in a context where suggestibility would not be a factor, does it cause changes that can be objectively observed? And so basically I found that was the case. There are some stimuli, some words with people that have been trained that way, and they will switch or dissociate. And one of the problems is that many of these survivors are unaware of the particular stimuli that they will be triggered by. And so I know that your writing on the Franklin scandal is very significant. And if you look at the cast of characters there, you see people sometimes doing things that you might not expect or might be atypical of them. And of course, if these people are multiple, that would sort of explain the contrasting behaviors, the contrasting values. So someone might be very religious in one moment and then not what we would think of as traditionally religious or even criminal in another context. And so some of these people might have alter personalities that might come out on their own or that might be triggered. In the case of sexual abuse, I found that many of the clients I saw could be triggered, and they would have parts appear that would describe themselves as well. I had one survivor. She was not my actual client, but I had her come to the class I teach at my university, and I used one of these triggers with her in the class, and she said to the class, she said, "I'm ready for sex." It's like, I had not expected that reaction to occur. I expected her to switch, but anyway, she explained that so the point is, people might be trained to be dissociative. They might be trained also to be sexual or violent. If you know how to trigger the particular kind of part you want, you might get that. So some of my clients talked about being repeatedly molested or sexually abused. And as we sort of reconstructed the situation, it appears that oftentimes they had been triggered by particular stimuli, and they would switch, and then they would think they were available, or they would behave as if they were available for sex. So of course, from a psychological perspective, this is rape. If you are manipulating someone to put them in a sexual state that they do not voluntarily choose, that's rape. But I think it happens, but law enforcement is not aware of the role that switching plays for those who are multiple, and that accessing through programming cues is viable also. So one of my students at Alliant, her husband was a police officer, and she said that he was always talking about women who made a police report that they had been raped, and by a male, and the male was very convincingly defended his innocence, and she agreed to this. Of course, either or both could have been dissociated. So if you're a dissociative male perpetrator, you can be the preacher's kid the next moment, and then you can be the rapist the next day. So I don't think law enforcement really understands that, and also the victims, they may be actually, they may be engaging in behaviors that are interpreted as flirtation. So this was actually something that Sigmund Freud early on commented about, was the seductiveness of these patients that he called hysterics. These were, in my judgment, women who had been abused, And
Freud wanted to run away from that as fast as he could. Ergo hysteria.
Yeah, but psychologists and therapists can make a contribution by not overreacting when they have a client in their office who starts behaving flirtatiously. I've had many of them respond with gratitude when I say, you don't have to do that anymore. But the point is, from my perspective, many of them were trained to do that. And when they're often, if they switch and they go into one of those states, they will take on the role of the seductress. This was something, again, even Freud observed, although he did not, Freud didn't attribute it to dissociation. Freud sort of rejected the whole notion of dissociation that had earlier been proposed by Pierre Genet. But Freud also eventually gave up his seduction hypothesis when he started working with a client who described ritual abuse. My perspective is that he lacked the courage to continue working and helping people that were really in a desperate situation. And there's actually a book written about that by another author, The Betrayal of Truth.
Jeffrey Mason.
Yeah.
I've talked about it before on my show. So programmers, who are these programmers? Who are they programming for?
Well, the way I look at it is I don't really know, but the stories that are commonly told are that when you are abused, if you dissociate well and you're held in high regard by the abuse group, they may promote you, like in a military organization where you get promotions based on doing what you're ordered to do. And one of the things that many abuse survivors are ordered to do is to do harm to someone else. And so I don't know that that's the truth, but that's what they report. And so people might, if they're being abused like this, they might find some degree of safety in going along with the abuse group and by being an abuser themselves.
According to the Extreme Abuse Survey, 24% said that their mind control have been sponsored by the U.S. government. Have you come across government-sponsored mind control victims?
Well, I've come across people who say this. I'm not sure how much of this is government sponsored. Just like I said before, I'm not sure how much of this is really satanic. So if we go back to the Masons for a moment, the Masons are probably mostly honorable people, but because they're secret, there are some people who can do secret things there that are not commonly known. There are also spurious Freemasons, so one of the authors in this area is Lynn Brunet. I don't know if you have read any of her writing, Lynn Brunet from Australia.
I am familiar with her, but I have not read her writing.
Okay. She says she is a Masonic abuse survivor, and she wrote a book about Carl Jung and some other work related to art and some of the symbols used in art. But anyway, her way of avoiding being labeled as an anti-Mason is that she talks about spurious Freemasonry. And so many of or some of the spurious or unaccepted Masons are sometimes thought of as Luciferian rather than satanic.
With our government, we know that our government has employed some very nefarious people to
Right.
mind control.
Right.
I mean, Owen
Right.
Cameron, Loretta Bender, Jolly West. I mean, the
Right.
list
Right.
goes on and
Yeah,
on.
exactly. So I don't use the word government mind control because the word has actually two meanings. First is U.S. government. The other is shadow government. So some people think there's a shadow government. And of course, I don't know what's what, but there's certainly a lot of there's a lot of evidence that the U.S. was engaged in mind control research that was illegal and that did harm to people. To my knowledge, there's no proof that this was done with children, although I wouldn't, I wouldn't hold it past some individuals doing this in secret with children, but were those people representatives of the government, or were they nefarious individuals operating illegally within the government? I don't know. So, but yes, I have people who talk about this. And in fact, the woman who claimed to be a programmer said that much of her training was in this regard.
Loretta Bender was actually funded by a CIA cutout.
Oh, yeah, they funded lots of
she
people
was-
doing bad things.
She was giving LSD to children as young as 5 or 6 years old. So
I didn't know she was giving it to children, but that doesn't surprise me. People willing to do harm to others can, I think, be pressed to do even more unacceptable harm.
But her funding was coming from the CIA through a front company. So, I mean,
Right.
it's very obvious that
Yeah.
people in the CIA knew what she was up to.
Except that the secrecy was compartmentalized. So not everybody in the CIA would necessarily know the details, but only select individuals, again, like these fraternal organizations, where there might be. So I assume that the U.S. government is basically at least half honest. But I do presume that there are many dishonest and criminal people operating within the U.S. government. The problem is we don't have a good way to identify them.
Well, if they're in the government, now I probably have a skewed opinion on this, given my research over the last 20 years. But if they're in the government and they possess power, they're guilty until proven innocent. In my book,
Yeah, power corrupts.
I hate to be that way, but given what I've been researching the last 20 years, it's kind of led me to. And I know that there are good people in the government, but I've seen a lot of bad people in the government. So,
yes, absolutely. And not only the government in like high positions, but in child protective services and all the various arms of by which government provides services or benefits or what have you.
In the book you wrote with your wife, Pam, Occult, Ritual Abuse, Narratives, Evidence, and Healing. Now, what you and I have been talking about, there's a sizable segment out there that think that what we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes or so is completely psychotic. Ritual abuse doesn't exist. Mind control doesn't exist. What would you say to them?
Actually, the evidence is contrary. So if anybody actually is interested in evidence rather than opinions, so you and I have opinions, but we've also accumulated evidence, both of us. So we've gone out and researched a variety of these questions. And there are people who think that this is nutty. So I also that's partly why I'm interested in it. It seems like it's totally incredible, but there's considerable evidence in support of it. So it's like that makes this a very interesting topic for me. So
what's interesting to me is the FBI said really doesn't, that Lanning, there was a report,
Ken
and it
Lanning.
was authored by FBI profiler named Ken Lanning, who said that ritual abuse essentially didn't exist, although he'd never been in the field. These are what people told him.
Yeah.
These stories are what people told him, and he concluded it didn't exist because they probably told him that it didn't exist. So, but it's interesting. According to the FBI, there's no ritual abuse, and
well, according to Ken Lanning, but if you
yes,
talk to individual FBI agents, they all have different opinions.
but you know, you've got the Matamoros cult,
Right?
You've got the cult of Santa Marta, and then you've got Esteban Cervantes' cult. I mean, these guys were practicing some kind of black magic, and they were sacrificing people.
Right.
I mean,
And
this does go on in our world.
And this is another reason I try to steer away from just calling it satanic. I think anthropologists have pretty well established that there are a variety of religions and fraternal and other kinds of organizations, military, that use some malevolent practices. That's something that's been going on for a long time. So this is really beyond just sort of the Christian versus satanic conceptualization. It's a worldwide phenomenon where there's a use of rituals or circumscribed torture and abuse that produces dissociative states. It's not always done malevolently. So the North American Plains Indians have a ceremony called the sun dance, and it's not intended to be malevolent. It's intended to be the opportunity to see the Great Spirit. And in this involves a torturous ritual. I will avoid being graphic if I may, but it's a torturous ritual in which a person freely volunteers, an adult male freely volunteers to do it, and they do experience visions, and the whole thing of a vision quest can be prompted by that. It is considered sacred. So this is one of the few circumstances where we can demonstrate that torture can cause people to have hallucinations. Otherwise, we couldn't actually do a study like that, other than what you're mentioning is possibly rogue, like CIA and other intelligence-related rogue individuals certainly could do that without anyone's knowledge.
Well, the thing with the ghost dance is it's an endurance. I think it's 3 days. It lasts 3 days. Is that for?
So I think the ghost dance is different than the sun
not a
dance.
ghost dancer, but the sun dance. I think does it last 3 days?
I have never seen it. I've only seen it depicted in movies, and I've read books by people who said that they had that experience or did it. I don't recall anyone stating the length of it, but it's very painful. Basically, one's pectoral muscles are pierced and they're lifted up.
Yeah. A friend of mine used to be part of a Sundance community, and he would be like one of the people that help the sun dancers. So told me about it.
Okay.
So with the FBI, it says that certainly this type of thing doesn't exist. But what's really interesting to me, the FBI uses the term ritualistic when it's talking about serial killers. So serial killers can be ritualistic, but pedophiles aren't ritualistic. I mean, it's kind of it's kind of a conundrum that the FBI gets itself into, but no one really wants to debate about it. So there's no debate. And there's been a number of people that I mean, it's not like all serial killers are lone predators. We know about Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Bruno. There's Leonard Lake and Charles Ng and Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. I mean, they worked in tandem, I mean, to kill people. So it's not like all serial killers are just lone psychopaths.
Sure.
And I think that we would be much further down the road understanding this if the FBI had a little flexibility. And
yeah, but if some of the helpers are dissociated themselves, they may be unable to help in a full-throated manner, because they are dissociated. Some of them also may be sabotaging. So this is where I think in your book, you see multiple lines of sabotage in what otherwise should have been a legitimate investigation.
Absolutely. Randy, I really want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast.
My pleasure.
And have yourself a great night in Los Angeles.
Well, thank you. Same to you. It's great to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Randy. Take care.
Bye-bye, Nick.
Bye.